Hey.
Well, welcome everybody. We have a really great panel here, so I'm not going to waste any time before jumping into it. I think that the question, we're talking about corporate diplomacy, and I'm wondering, I'll pose this to whoever wants to jump in here. What are we actually talking about beyond the sort of academic sense, corporate diplomacy? Who's doing it well? Where is it working? What is happening that we should be paying attention to? You want to start us off?
I don't mind starting off because I think I've been invited onto this panel. It's my previous life before being a politician. It was for 10 years I was CEO of one of Britain's retailers called John Lewis. And that company was lucky enough to be voted by public across the UK over the last few years the most trusted company in Britain. So possibly immodestly, I would say we did it okay. And I think the really critical factor is consistency in how you carry out your values, because consumers actually see through whether, frankly, it's corporate spin or whether it's played out every single day. So that's about how you employ people, how you deal with the communities, how you deal with your suppliers in a retailer's case. But I would say it's all about consistency of application of those values. And the story of that company is that we were the financial crash of '08, when the sort of, let's call it, the most extreme versions of capitalism were challenged. It gave the opportunity for a different business, one that is owned by its employees, to actually emerge as a trusted brand because it was seen to be genuine in its beliefs.
And now you're looking at it from the other side of things.
Yep.
I want to come back to that in a moment.
Yep.
But let's. What does this actually mean in the real world?
So the funny thing is that Andy and I have this coincidence in common, because I'm on a leave of absence from Amazon.com, and they were one of our best competitors in the UK. And I'm now working for 2 years for the Italian government to run the digital transformation office. And what I want to add to what Andy just said is companies like Amazon, the big internet companies, are more and more becoming aware of the fact that we found ourselves all of a sudden growing with feet in smaller shoes. We, as Amazon, in this case with my previous hat, we thought that for the mere fact that we're doing our business model right, we're making consumers happy, by definition, we're doing goodness. Without realizing that when you grow in size, when you grow in popularity, when you grow in being a reference model, you have to go beyond that, and goes beyond that, and not just deal with the public, the government, the communities in the regular business, but also being an active part of that. And then they said it happens fast, much faster than you can realize it.
Daniel, what do you think? You have the perspective not of
Sure.
working at these companies exactly.
So I think that, when you think about what's the concept of corporate diplomacy, is that you look at, kind of what are the value drivers typically for any business. You have to deal with your customers, your employees, your suppliers, and so forth. And these are all contractual, voluntary relationships. Corporate diplomacy comes in with all those factors that influence the success of the business, that you're not in a contractual business relationship. Activist groups, the media, regulators, politicians, and so forth. And one of the things that in my experience at least, that you see is that companies that are legacy companies that had to deal with this for many, many years just get better then and have bigger capacity. Tech companies or companies that grow fast typically have difficulties. A little bit of the kind of the shoes, the capacity is not growing at the same time. But I think there's another piece there. This is certainly true about the US. Is there's a little bit of a West Coast attitude that government doesn't matter and can have an impact on your business. But when you look at the history of high-tech companies, there was always the moment when they had to deal with it, whether it was antitrust or privacy or cybersecurity, where those type of factors become much more important, and then they have to go to this near-death experience, and then they build the capacity. So that's, I think, that's the overall structure, and I think particularly in tech, in high entrepreneurial companies, very often management underestimates the importance of these issues, and then they're behind, and then they have to deal with issues.
So aside from the two companies that these two gentlemen worked for, where do you see this actually working? Which legacy company, or maybe outside of a legacy company?
So you look at this, I think you just kind of look around. Which companies do this well now? McDonald's, GE, Walmart, those type of companies. In the case of Walmart, actually, they also were a little bit flat-footed about 10 years ago, but they developed a very strong capacity to deal with those challenges. And each challenge is different. So in a case of McDonald's, it may have to do with nutrition or food safety and so forth, or marketing. In the case of Walmart, it has to do with the ability to get licenses to build stores when there may be community issues for them to expand. So the specific challenges are very company and industry specific, but you see it particularly in these kind of more established, older companies that just had to build a capacity in order to be able to successful to execute their business.
Andy, I'm wondering now from your sitting as mayor, the companies that he just ran through, do they seem like companies that are doing it well from your perspective now, or even just the question about legacy companies?
Okay. Well, inevitably, some of the companies just quoted operate in the US, not the UK. So it's difficult to judge that from the position of a UK mayor. Right. But I think the point that is right is that sitting looking at this, now someone moved into that public office, the companies that are admired are those who are seen to make a contribution to the public debate. Now, too often, I think companies decide, unless there's something in it for them, they're going to stay silent. And I think always companies, certainly in the UK, who win through are those who are seen to be brave, make a contribution, get on board with the big public issues. So if it be, I don't know, anything from childhood obesity to dealing with the sort of digitization of the groups in the UK who perhaps wouldn't move into digital skills themselves, there is a real opportunity for companies to shift the impression of them by taking part in these big public campaigns. And anyone sitting in a city hall is certainly going to welcome that.
Oh, what can governments do to help facilitate this process, to make it so that companies want to take this role on and make it something that once they make that decision, that they're not struggling with, but that they're glad that they made that decision. Let's start.
Well, I think
again, just because you've had this experience on both sides.
Yeah, but I'll actually give you a slightly different answer to that. I think the other question for government is whether it takes a rather strident view on some of the issues that destroy corporate reputations. Now, again, I'd be interested because in the US response to this, but certainly the issue in the UK is corporate greed and excesses of boardroom pay. And that definitely, if you look at the relative sharing of returns, applies in the tech sector. And so when our new Prime Minister came into position last year, there was a sort of sense that this issue would be tackled by the British government in a way that it hadn't been for the 15 years before. So I do think there is definitely a role for central government in containing some of the least enhancing elements of corporate behaviour. Interesting story is the British government has slightly stepped back from the possibility of doing that.
Daniel, just because Andy raised that point about the U.S.
Sure. That's an interesting dimension. I want to make one thing before I come back to something that Andy said before. I think what you want to distinguish is that there are some companies that position themselves as having kind of a social component to their business. So Whole Foods has that in the U.S., but there's a whole bunch of other companies like that. Patagonia is another one that basically say, we're not only about making money or generating value for shareholders, we're also trying to have a social component to that, and that can certainly go a long way. There's another piece here, though, is that even if you're not doing that, even if you're like, in telecom or food processing, completely different businesses that don't have that particular social dimension to them, you still have to have these capabilities. And something that Andy was talking about is the compensation aspect, which is super interesting from my point of view, because at least in the US context, there's a real bifurcation. There was huge controversy over compensation, particularly after the financial crisis, both in banking, insurance, and other industries. But nobody had any issue with compensation in the tech sector. So where the compensation is much higher. And so I think there it's not the level of compensation per se, but there's a question of whether the people that are compensated to how you're actually creating value for customers and for kind of broader constituencies that's relevant here.
Diego, the question I put to Andy of what companies can be, what governments can be doing to facilitate this for companies. From your perspective, what would that be?
Well, from my specific role, which is about technology in the government, I don't know, we'll be narrowing down to that part. I think that one of the biggest issues that we have today to digitalize governments is the relationship between technology companies as technology vendors and government as buyers. It's a major issue. It's a major issue because the relationship has not kept up with the way that technology has been improving. I mean, specifically looking at the Italian government, you still have procurement rules that were built when governments were investing in highways and building dams and building infrastructures. And therefore, they haven't been able to narrow down to limit the number of months of a duration of a procurement. They're still using old systems like functional points.
Yeah.
At the same time, the technology companies, they don't feel a responsibility to help the government to modernize, and they just comply with the request. So we need to create government and companies this kind of alliance where together they improve the way that technology procurement and technology development, hence digitalization of governments, happen. And that's a major issue. I mean, if you look at all governments in general, and you look at the reasons for the digitalization being so far behind, is technology procurement. It's not the only issue, but I would put that probably number one and number two.
Well, that seems to speak to the point you were making about the West Coast mentality of companies just saying, we don't need government, we're not going to think about government, right?
Yeah, but I think there's like something that Diego has been talking about. There's kind of a switch of that now. And so you see this emergence of these kind of GovTech companies that are trying to provide technological solutions for governments to be more effective, whether it's on the procurement side or engagement or with their constituencies. So I think we're seeing in some sense a convergence of that. One of the challenges of that is that from the corporate side, now you have to deal with the whole kind of political decision-making process in order to implement those types of solutions, which has its own challenges. And of course, from the companies that operate in that space, you now have to be able to be they have a capability to sell to government or to support government. That's just very different than having a corporate customer.
Andy?
Yeah, can I just support that? Because that's, I think, an opportunity that the tech sector is yet to exploit. So interestingly, in the back at home, just this week, we held a summit for what we called GovTech startups and actually put on the table opportunities for startups to help solve some of the public service issues in the West Midlands. And I see there is a real role for us to be the sort of bridge to bring the two halves of this debate together. Because for some reason, thus far, the public sector haven't made the opportunities clear and the tech companies haven't penetrated. So certainly there is an opportunity. And we did it through the form of a competition, but we want that just to be the start of a process to bring that about.
Let me, if you don't mind, I keep going. The opportunity, by the way, of improving that relationship not necessarily comes, actually oftentimes doesn't come from the old legacy technology companies.
Yes.
That are the ones that should modernize, but the startups that are building software APIs, services that can connect the old software with a new way of digitalization. I mean, there are startups now that are specialized in solving the problems of the tens of millions of lines of COBOL that still exist in government and how to transform that legacy system. It's not the companies that wrote that code that are doing this. It's someone else that is disrupting. So what the government can do is facilitate startups to sell to government. Today, there are still too many strict rules for which only the large guys, the big guys, can do those procurement tenders.
Well, what do you do about the fact that the skills that are being sought in the public sector are not always going to be there, and how you address that as this relationship is taking place?
I think the way Diego does it, right?
Yeah.
So you have like people that have a strong tech background, but then they go for a short time in a governmental context and bring those expertise in, and then you can have a dramatic impact. It's very or people that just want to have a more of a social impact or political at a particular point in their career. But what that means is that on the governmental side there has to be permeability so that people can come in and out rather than having a
set of processes.
Exactly.
Right.
Rather than having a kind of very traditional kind of public sector employment structure that makes it difficult and unattractive basically for people that come from outside of government to bring their expertise to the forefront.
And in a sense, I was looking slightly surprised because I'm not sure the question is right, because this isn't about government bringing in those skills. Right. It's actually about government being open and letting other people solve its problems. And the best way to be open is actually to share its data and then say to other people, what can you do with this, in a way in which, frankly, government will never be able to do that.
Just to give you an idea on that, so I'm on the board of a GovTech company called Citybase that are making it easier for people to do payments with like local governments. And what we found is that there's a whole new generation in municipalities and cities in the US, where these are basically people in their 30s, chief information officers, chief technology officers. Many of them came from tech companies and then moved into that space. But it's important to have that expertise sitting inside as well, because otherwise the GovTech companies don't have a partner. Then you're dealing with kind of a legacy structure, and you just can't get in. They don't understand what you're talking about.
It's what I see every single day. By the way, it's not about the government building everything from a technology standpoint, but it's moving a little further the line of the knowledge.
Yes.
I mean, there is the education department in the Italian government that has entirely outsourced, even the architecture, the design of the product, everything, to external vendors. You need to have at least the product design, the technology architecture skills and knowledge to audit. Now ask for and audit what's being built. So it is, as I said, it's not about everything done in-house. God forgive us to do that. But it's moving a little further that level of competence.
Since you've been held up as the example of what should be happening here, Diego, can you how common is it in the Italian government? What is the structure that's been built there to make it possible for you to make this transition so fluidly?
That is a very interesting question. I need to build 30 seconds of context. Okay. I was seeked and asked to come by Matteo Renzi, which was the then prime minister, who really had this big disruption goal on how to change things. And he realized that no systems can disrupt itself from the inside. And he was calling people from the outside. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying, but that's the point. So when I came in, Italy already had and still has a digital agency of a team of about 100 people. But they're the least digitalized place in the government. So the theory and the practice was, let's build something from outside. I have a team of 20 people today that I could be given my role of commissioner. I could hire from the private world and people that are coming for about 2 years. And therefore, yes, we're doing something with the existing digital agency, but we're working from the outside. Otherwise, we've been absorbed by the legacy. Now, it is an exceptional situation. So one of the biggest objectives I have for when I leave 1 year from now is to build a legacy that can continue in that direction.
So what do you do to incentivize this from the corporate side to make companies more interested in playing this role? You both cited your own experience. How do you, if there's a company that isn't as involved in corporate diplomacy in the way that you want them to be, what do you say to them?
I think you say to them that long-term value is created through doing this. And I would look through the British Stock Exchange and be able to demonstrate that the real winners have absolutely engaged. I would also say to you that young people are making their decisions on who to work for based on this in a very big way, and that companies fail in that respect won't recruit the best. That seems a very powerful tool in the UK. And I'd also say that you establish your brand value, it's back to the stock exchange point really, by doing this, so there's a real financial return.
And have you had those conversations with companies, with CEOs?
Yes, I have. And I've always, when I was CEO of my company, I was quite, to say the word renowned is not true, but I always like to say that I would be someone who stepped forward and spoke my mind on these public issues. Got myself in trouble, if I'm very honest, on occasions, but it never did us any harm. So I would sit, I've done it, well, I left the corporate world, didn't I? But I would always say to other CEOs that, yeah, you should step forward and speak your mind. And interestingly, not being a quoted company enabled us to do it more than if you were a quoted company where it tended to bring out a very sort of cautious approach.
Daniel, I wonder, what do you do? Is there anything else that happens that can happen to incentivize people? You just look at it's somewhat ambiguous, right? To say, look at the long-term value proposition.
I think that something that Andy said is spot on, and I would add a couple of pieces to that. So there is there's clear empirical evidence that when you look at particularly younger generations, they put a lot of value on what I would call kind of social responsibility values: diversity, inclusion, environmental responsibility, labor standards, and so forth. That is absolutely the case. And by the way, that's true everywhere in the world. It's not just a kind of European phenomenon. But when you look over time in Asia, Latin America, you can see the same. And add to that, I think the dramatic explosion, of course, of social media and so forth, which just makes it very difficult for businesses to hide anything. 20 years ago, you could have a business operation in a faraway country, and you needed some newspaper, the New York Times, to kind of figure it out. Now all you need is somebody with an iPhone, an activist that's working locally, and you have a problem. So the value for companies to behave in a responsible, ethical fashion has just dramatically increased. And on the other hand, the risk of not doing so has increased on the other side. So I think there's more and more now real evidence to that, and kind of structural factors that are all pointing in the same direction. And of course, you see this even with legacy companies now engaging in that, or trying to engage in that, whether that is corporate social responsibility initiatives or sustainability work that they're doing. That, I think, is just a long-term trend. We're going to see more and more of that.
Diego, in Italy, do companies get it? Are they seeing things in the way that you want them to be?
Well, it's
aside from Amazon.
You can't answer it with an average here, but I would say that I see more and more signals. I mean, Italy's been one of the first countries recognizing benefit corporation as entities, and they're investing in that regard. Italy is a long legacy of cheesy relationship between government and companies and citizens. This is dramatically changing, but I do see the very positive trend in that direction for the same reasons that Daniel just mentioned. At the same time, in general, what I'm personally asking also companies is when they interrelate with the government, they should also update themselves. Let me give you an example what I mean. I still get calls to speak with companies from lobbyists. I mean, the job of the lobbyist is old now. They can interrelate with government with way more modern tools. I mean, use that social media. And also the companies themselves. It makes me sometimes smile that top technology companies still use old-style lobbyists to interrelate with the government. Wake up, guys. Just come up with us. I mean, governments are a little different than you used to be.
I wonder, we're all of us from countries that have experienced some political turmoil in the last year and a half.
Well, I'm going to be seeing 3 governments in 2 years.
So I think you win, at least for the number of governments. But what is the current political mood in all of our countries and what we see going on all around the world due to change where the responsibilities are and where the results of this are going to be?
I'll give you might not be spot on to your question, but I think it's an interesting reflection because we're trying hard not to have 3 governments in 3 years, basically, at the moment. But God knows.
We're doing
How's it going?
It's not going too well, is the honest answer. But there we go. But I think the thing that does come out, actually, in the boardrooms of Britain as they're all faced with the Brexit question is actually that is, and people might shout me down for saying this, a short-term political issue. Actually, how companies deal with the technological transformation is a far bigger and far more important question than, frankly, whether we're going to have tariffs on this, that, or other. Not that that is unimportant to the short-term trading points, but that is the real issue over the next 10 years. And I haven't just said that because I happened to be at a tech summit today. That is a story in the West Midlands we are trying to talk with our companies about all the time. And actually, the other point is, of course, about the value of your company in terms of your workforce, your ideas, your ability to innovate, given that technological change. And that's where the real focus has got to be, not in the political debate.
Daniel, I feel like Diego should close us out because he wins the number of governments in 2 years.
He wins on the number of governments. So I think, like, there are kind of 2 things that I think are super important. And one is, I think, a long-term issue, one maybe a little bit more short-term. And the first one is, at least everywhere I'm looking, is that certainly in the United States, this increasing in polarization and, not being able to basically even have conversations across the political line. You know this, Isaac, much better than most people. That's very dangerous. I think it just makes it very difficult to have the necessary compromise that you need to have, good, well-designed policies moving over. And we see this on almost everything that's going on in the United States right now. The second piece, I think, and that is something there where the technological side and innovation is an important part, is that I think you have, certainly to the United States, some parts of Europe as well, you have real losers of the technological revolution, that whose skills basically are no longer relevant, and you have large segments now where their overall income has collapsed by 15-20%, and then, that's a real deal. That's a real issue. So how to think about technological process, innovation, and in a way that is more inclusive, I think is a hugely important question and not clear at all.
Diego is someone who's looking at this from the domestic turmoil and global turmoil, but also, as you point out, you came into the job with the previous prime minister, and you're still there, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly the point, because I finally see that the job of transforming the digital transformation of a government, first of all, it's a way for governments to understand that technology is not something just to regulate and to be afraid of, but it's a tool that they need to use to simplify and improve the relationship between governments and citizens and governments and businesses. And one of the things that I've noticed, although I said that this morning, I was appointed by Matteo Renzi of a given party. He lost the referendum. There was a continuation on his party. There's going to be elections again. But I am receiving very little criticisms of a political standpoint, because parties understand that governments, they need to modernize.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a political color. And this is the part of politics that is just not about slogan, but it's about problem solving.
That's sort of an uplifting note to end it on, and right on time. So
look at that.
A hand for our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.